Thank you, Jack and Julianne. All God's people said, Amen. Amen. Aren't all of our kids just so precious to us? They're so special. Last Lord's Day, didn't get a chance to speak to Abigail and Jonathan and their kids until after service was over, and they were getting in the car outside, and so I went out so I could speak to them. And so we started talking, and Abigail said, Jack was going to school this week. It was his first week of school, and we talked a little bit. And I said, as I was getting ready to walk away, I said, "You have a good week at school, Jack." And he went, "Thank you." it was just so precious. I didn't know what he was going to say, but it was, "Thank you." Yeah. And I trust he did. I trust all of our young people. I had a wonderful week, and teachers who are here today, are you going back tomorrow? Just okay. No, you're not going back. Okay, okay. Well, I hope you are. I hope it was a good enough week to be able to want to go back. And so we continue in our sermon series from the book of James. We are getting close to the end. We're beginning chapter 5 today, and we're going to do 3 sermons out of this chapter, and so we'll finish up in a couple of weeks and then begin something new next month, and I'll give you some hints on that a little bit later on. But for now, we're going to look at the first 6 verses in the book of in James chapter 5. And so if you want to turn there, we'll get to it in just a second. I know I'm not alone when I speak about this. All of us have been in this situation where we have experienced various financial difficulties in life. Things have not always gone as we had hoped or anticipated, and many of us, especially folks who are older now, who might have been, and you would have to have been, I guess, pretty much in your 90s or 100s now to have been around to experience what we know as the Great Depression. Not many of those folk around anymore, but folks that went through extremely difficult times, a little bit hesitant or want to make certain that they have stockpiled something for the future because of all the things that could happen. And we hate the prospect, do we not, of being without or having our needs go unmet. We want to make certain that we've put aside enough or squared away enough to make certain that life in the days ahead will not be ones where we have to stand on the corner with a tin cup begging. Someone has said it like this, and I think a lot of people have said this. As I looked up this quote, they couldn't tell me who actually said it first, but lots of people have said it, and that is this. Someone has said, "I've been rich and I've been poor, and rich is better." Now, many of us in here today, we don't think of ourselves as rich. By comparison with the rest of the world, we are extremely rich. And many of us, probably most of us, have never been as poor or as destitute as the majority of people in the world today. And so we've been rich and we've been poor. Rich is better. But we understand, one of the things we need to come to understand anyway, is the earning and using of money is first and foremost a spiritual concept. Jesus spoke about money more than just about any other topic because early on in his ministry in the Sermon on the Mount, he talked about the fact that we're going to be choosing between gods. We're going to be choosing between the God of heaven and the God of the earth, which is, he said, money. So if you want to turn your scriptures to James 5, we're going to look at the first 6 verses there and see this warning that he gives to rich. If you had a heading there, it probably says warning to rich oppressors. And here's what James writes. "Now listen, you rich people, weep and wail because of the misery that's coming upon you. Your wealth has rotted and moths have eaten your clothes. Your gold and silver are corroded. Their corrosion will testify against you and eat your flesh like fire." Boy, that's a pretty picture, isn't it? "You have hoarded wealth in the last days. Look, the wages you failed to pay to the workmen who mowed your fields are crying out against you. The cries of the harvesters have reached the ears of the Lord Almighty. You have lived on earth in luxury and self-indulgence. You have fattened yourselves in the day of slaughter. You have condemned and murdered innocent men who were not opposing you." Now, this is not a very pretty picture that James is painting of the things that have happened, he says, especially with those who have found themselves better off financially than most. James's point deals with those who have made the accumulation of riches their chief aim. And he says that rich folk in that particular arena should lament their circumstances. In fact, one of the earlier sermons we preached from the 2nd chapter, we talked about the poor rich. The poor rich. Now, this is not an indiscriminate charge that James is leveling against possessing wealth. Scripture nowhere condemns the possession of wealth per se. Abraham, David, Solomon, Job, we know all these individuals were possessors of vast amounts of wealth. The difficulty that he's describing is the inability of the rich to keep sin away from their lives. And the greatest sin of all is what Paul would write about in 1 Timothy chapter 6, and that is not to trust in those riches. Let me ask you something. If you go to the store and you have $5 in your pocket, are you a little more discriminatory about where you stop and pick up something? You know, you don't. If I only got $5, so I got to make certain that what I buy is really what I need. But if you got a couple $100 in your pocket, you're thinking differently. And that's one of the things I've observed over the years, that I think differently when I have more money in my pocket and I go to the store than when I have less money in my pocket. And that's kind of the idea that James is talking about in this whole process. And so when Jesus says things like it's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than it is for rich men to enter the kingdom of heaven, or no man can serve two masters, either he will hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money. Then we should realize how difficult the attitude of acquiring and accumulating stuff, if you will, can be. Keith Hughes, in his commentary on the book of James, says material possessions tend to focus one's thoughts and interests on the world only. And wealth gradually enslaves those who are attracted to it and perverts their values. And we see that all the time, don't we? The more we have, the easier it is to be possessed by our possessions, comforts, and recreations. And James says the wealthy ought to think about being sad rather than being happy, because there's tremendous responsibility in being able to disseminate and be steward over a whole lot and not fall prey to the sin that can be part of it. And so James mentions 4 things of which the rich of his day were guilty, and I want to call it the burden of wealth, if you will. The first thing he says they do is they hoard. People like this hoard. They even have a television show about it, don't they? I mean, you can turn it on and watch people who've just stuffed away things for 50, 60 years, and you can't get through their houses, through their homes. Bertha Adams was 71 years old when she died in West Palm Beach, Florida in 1976. And the coroner's report said that she died of malnutrition after wasting away to only 50 pounds. And when authorities investigated her home, they found nothing but a pigsty. And for years, Bertha had begged food from neighbors and gotten her clothes from the Salvation Army. And by all accounts, all appearances, she was penniless. But this, however, was not the case. Among the garbage heap of her belongings were discovered 2 keys which led to officials to safety deposit boxes at 2 different banks. And in the first box, it had over 700 AT&T stock certificates, along with other types of stocks and bonds, and $200,000 in cash. The second bank, safety deposit box, had only cash, $600,000 to be exact, and so the net worth of those 2 boxes was over $1 million, where she had saved it up, never intending to use it. Hetty Green is recognized in the Guinness Book of World Records as the world's greatest miser. When she died, she was worth $90-some million. And she was so stingy that her son had to have a leg amputated because of the delays in finding a free medical clinic. And she died of apoplexy from arguing over the virtues of skim milk. You ever think about that word miser? You realize it only takes 1 letter added to that word to turn miser into misery? Some call it collecting. It can be called duplicity, and that is the multiplying of unnecessary items, having things just because we feel the need to have them. holding on to those things that might actually be a benefit to someone else if we could turn loose of them. Someone has said, and I found this recently, I love this quote. Didn't have a person's name attached to it, but I love it. The best way to get enough is to desire less. Isn't that insightful? The best way to get enough is to desire less. I think Jesus would have said that. That's the kind of thing he was talking about. I think James has that in mind. You see, many people possess all they can see horizontally, but possess nothing vertically. And don't we know people like this? They own as much as you can see every direction, but when it comes to a relationship with the Lord, they have none. Now, the circumstances in James's day were interesting because it was centered around agriculture, not so unlike our area, not so unlike America in past, when most people were in rural settings. And wealth was kind of conceived or existed in three forms: harvested grain, clothing, and precious metals. You didn't have money stacked away, or you didn't have stocks and bonds and all these other kinds of things. And hoarding of these things profited little because of what could happen to them. James talks about how the grain rots and the clothing can be moth-eaten and metals can corrode. Reminds us of what Jesus said in Matthew 6:19, doesn't it? Do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth where moth and rust doth corrupt and thieves break in and steal. Now today, we found a way to fix that. I can have all I want, and I can make certain that no one takes it or nothing happens to it by buying what? Insurance. I get insurance, and if anybody steals it, then I don't have anything to worry about. And so we think so highly of the things that we've taken a hold of, and I'm chief among sinners. We think so highly of that we paid money to make certain that if someone gets it, we can get something back. And James offers this warning. He said the riches and the wealth of people will serve as witnesses against them because of two reasons. First reason is because of the refusal to share. Now, both the reasons are connected, but I'll start with that one, the refusal to share. You may remember the parable of Jesus told of the rich man in Luke 12, where he had a bumper crop and got so much that he didn't have room in his barns, and so instead of helping someone out with what he had, the excess, and sharing it with someone else, he said, well, I don't know what I'm going to do. I'm just going to tear down my barns and build bigger ones. And that's what he did. Or Luke 16, the parable of the rich man and Lazarus. When they passed away from this life, they wind up in the rich man winds up in torment because Lazarus, a poor man, had been at his door begging every day, and nothing was ever done for him. Now, these men in the stories angered God because of their selfishness and their greed, and their lives became forfeited because of that. So our riches and wealth can serve as a witness against us because of the refusal to share, and like I say, closely attached to that is the refusal to bless. How much good could our material blessings do to assist in the ministry of the kingdom if we weren't so tightly holding on to it? That's the kind of thing that James is talking about there. In James chapter 2, verse 15, remember these words? Suppose a brother or sister is without clothes and daily food, and one of you says, go, I wish you well, keep warm and well fed, but does nothing about his physical needs. What good is that? If you're anything like me, you look around, you see people all the time who are in, just in bad situations, and you feel for them. Oh, I really feel for them. You ever say that? I feel badly for them. I hate that for them. I'm sorry for them. James said, that's nice of you. That's really nice of you. Doesn't do much good, but it's nice of you. Second thing he says people do in addition to hoarding is they defraud. Notice what he says here. There's a bunch of cheating going on. That's how a lot of times folks get a whole lot of money. There's a whole lot of cheating going on. And he says primarily it comes from paying insignificant wages. Deuteronomy chapter 24, verses 14 and 15 say this: do not take advantage of a hired man who is poor and needy, whether he is a brother Israelite or an alien living in one of your towns. Pay him his wages each day before sunset because he is poor and counting on it. Otherwise, he may cry to the Lord against you, and you will be guilty of sin. You see, it was a responsibility for the employers to make certain that the hirees, the employees, got paid at the end of the day. That made certain that they did not starve, that they had something to eat that day, that they could clothe themselves and not freeze to death. It's kind of an interesting scenario, isn't it? So the scene you have painted for you here is the workers are out mowing in the field. Now, we know something about that in this area. We know something about mowing. Most time we're mowing grass, or someone is. I don't do much mowing, but most time we're mowing grass. But there are a lot of grain things that get cut. But the workers are mowing in the fields so the rich can have bread. And the rich were profiting in the sense that they could eat. They could get bread out of the whole thing. But the workers then had to turn around, and whatever they made that day, they had to pay to buy the bread, you see. And the disparity of wages and earnings back then was tremendous, as it often is today. When Janice and I were living in Indiana, it was 3 or 4 years before we moved from there, a company in North Carolina bought a company in the town where we lived. It was a major deal. I mean, a blockbuster deal. Huge amounts of money being tossed around with these two companies, one buying the other out. And so when the merger took place, they installed a gentleman as the new CEO. After one day of work, they decided that he wasn't the person that should lead them into the future. And so they went ahead and terminated him and put someone else in that position. The severance pay this guy got for one day was $44 million. Now, I don't know much about business. You can probably look at me and tell that, but I know that's a little excessive for an 8-hour day or 10-hour day or even a 24-hour day. Now, I know he's probably been with the company a long, long time and all that, but $44 million for one day of severance for this gentleman. Now, as James was talking about this, then he moves into the arena of Christian businessmen, and it's just an atrocity for it to spill over into the church, as James describes perhaps that it has. In his book, Lust for Life, which was later made into a movie starring Kirk Douglas, Irvin Stone tells us that it was this type of attitude among Christians, wealthy Christians who were exploiting the poor, which caused one-time evangelist Vincent van Gogh to give up the faith. After he watched what was being done by some Christians, he said, this is not right, and he turned his back on the faith. So I have a question, I guess, as it kind of boils down, all this boils down. Is it better for Christian employers to pay adequate wages to his or her employees, or to make donations to organizations and institutions so that their name can be on the side of a building? I'll let someone else judge that. The question's just out there. And so what happens? What does James say is going to happen? Well, the unpaid wages, he says, cries out from the ground like the blood of Abel cried out from the ground after Cain murdered him, because this is pretty much what was happening to these poor folk. And the cries of the workers themselves were reaching the ears of the Lord. And James says, you don't want that to happen. You don't want that to happen, he says. And so in addition to people hoarding and people defrauding, what else does he say? Well, they indulge. Now, one of the more difficult questions that we ever have to answer with regard to our stewardship and our finances is this. How can we know for certain when we've gone from having the necessities of life to living a life of luxury? Where do you cross that line? It's a difficult question. I understand it. But in some ways, you think, how can we not know? Juan Carlos Ortiz, in his book Disciple, gives us a little bit of a hint. Here's what he says. He says, if you have a plate of food, or if I have a plate of food, rather, and my neighbor doesn't, to love him is to make the same effort to get food for him as I did for myself. If I cannot, then I should give him half of what I have. If I have 2 suits and he has none, I must make the same effort to get him 2 suits as I did mine. If my children are well dressed and fed and going to school and his are not, I must make the same effort for his children that I make for my own. In every congregation, he says, we have people who have too much and people who have nothing. And one believer has a nice big car, and one goes home to a big nice house with turkey and roast beef waiting. And together they sing about how much they love each other, and when the meeting's over, they say to each other, "Goodbye, God bless you, brother," and each goes his own way, is what Ortiz has to say. In the early 1980s, Janice and I were visiting with her parents in Florida. And it was on a Sunday night, and I think I've shared this with you before, but it's one of the, I can still see this. It's been over 40 years, or right at 40 years, and I can still see the program on television and hear the words as if they were being spoken right now. 60 Minutes was interviewing a king who had just been coronated over some country in Africa. And they spent on this. The people in the country were starving. They had no food. They had no money. They were destitute. And on this one day for this coronation for this king, they spent $25 million for his coronation. They spent $1 million on his crown, $4 million on a scepter, and the other $20 million to feed all the dignitaries who were going to show up for this coronation. And when 60 Minutes asked him about this tremendous expense that was being poured out by his country for his coronation while the country was starving, his response was classic. He said, "Well, sacrifices have to be made." Yes, they do. Just don't ask me to be one of them doing it. So what are some of the possible crimes of the self-indulgent? Well, not to know when we pass saving and start hoarding is one. Not to know when we've cheated workers is another. Not to know how we've injured the righteous is one. I don't know, maybe perhaps we just can't help but know when we become indulgent. As I thought about this, I came up with this question for myself. Share it with you if you want to deal with it yourself, you go ahead. But I thought about, my question for myself was this: can I live a reasonably normal and sufficient life and lifestyle without some particular excess? Can I make it through just fine without accumulating more? Some of us remember the great David Thompson, who played basketball at North Carolina State University back in the mid-'70s. As far as I'm concerned, he's the best that's ever played in the Atlantic Coast Conference, and perhaps one of the 5 or 10 best that's ever played in college basketball. And I remember after he was drafted into the ABA, I guess at the time it was the Denver Nuggets, and they were interviewing him and talking about all the money he was going to make and all that. And he was, of course, a down-home North Carolina boy who was confident that he was never going to be lured by all the attractiveness of wealth and riches. And he said, "What do I need a whole closet full of suits for? I can only wear one at a time." And unfortunately, the money that came his way led to a lifestyle of indulgence of all kinds that cost him probably his career as well as his standing before people. Fortunately, the Lord blessed him and brought him back on a good path. People are hoarding. People are indulging. James says people are defrauding. The last thing he says is they condemn and kill. Now, we talked about this a week or so ago, where is he really talking about, people being killed here? Well, whether he's talking about actual physical violence or not, we can't say with certain. It's possible that some people had gotten so angry over certain things that they had actually killed. We don't know. But what was happening was that folks with the money, the rich, were manipulating the system so that they were killing off all the opportunities that other people might have to better themselves or to receive what was due them. The rich people of James' day had taken away the means whereby the underprivileged, if you will, could make their living. And those who owned the lands and those who had the money and the power, they controlled the courts, and so the poor had no way of getting any kind of justice whatsoever. And that's why James says, look, they can't cry out to the courts because you own the courts, but let me tell you what they will do. They'll cry out to the Lord. And we can see that in our own nation, not just from the standpoint of money, but from the standpoint of just justice in general. And this applies across the board to all groups of folk. including those of us who are part of the body of Christ. If we're denied justice, we cry out to the Lord, He takes care of it. But this apparently what was happening in the nation of Israel was one of the most prominent crimes or sins of the Jewish people, that of their leaders who oppressed the poor by through the creation of the indulgent, the rich by the indulging. The legal system did not aid them at all, and in many cases, unfortunately, that's true of today. And so one Christian writer suggests that we ask ourselves some of these kind of questions. Do I hoard? Am I guilty of the overaccumulation of wealth? Am I defrauding someone? Is there financial deception in my life? Have I succumbed to the cultural song of self-indulgence? Are there material excesses in my life? Have I victimized another because of the monetary advantage which I wish to possess? The Apostle Paul had a lot to say about these kind of things, as well as did Jesus, but most of us, or many of us anyway, will remember these words from 1 Timothy chapter 6, verses 9 and 10. People who want to get rich fall into temptation and a trap and into many harmful desires that plunge men into ruin and destruction. For the love of money is the root of all kinds of evil. Some people, eager for money, have wandered from the faith and pierced themselves with many griefs. It is so true that as many of the wonderful blessings that riches can afford us, if we're not careful, if we don't know how to use them properly, they can bring us just as much destruction and devastation. Many of us in this room know people who've gone down that path, whose lifestyles has caused them more grief than they intended. Oh, it was such a red carpet moment when everything was just going our way, and yet that's where the downfall came. I'd like to think that none of us in here this morning fit into the category of the people that James was describing in that passage. But all these things that we see in this book are so practical. They serve for such great warnings to any of us who may be contemplating walking in a path like that, whether or not we've gone down it or not. Certainly the most important thing is to think about our relationship with the Lord and how that relationship is worth more than all the materialistic things we could ever acquire on this earth. And that all the things that we do acquire, God is giving them to us so that we will have the opportunity to share with others and bless their lives. And I guess my appeal to us this morning would be that whenever we think about these things relative to what we're trying to do here as a congregation, that we be as generous as possible. I talk about this often, and it's a little caveat. You didn't ask for this sermon, you're going to get it anyway, but a little caveat. I'm just overwhelmed on Sunday mornings in the Sunday school class that I've been leading in the fellowship hall at the offerings that the people in that class give week in and week out, and what we've been able to do just with the Sunday school class and how we've sent money to all kinds of folk who need it. It's just been such an incredible blessing. I know it's a blessing to people get it, but it's a blessing to me to watch it happen. And I appreciate that. And as well as what we do here with the church in general. This is such an important thing because we don't live in a metropolitan area where we're going to be running into non-Christians outnumbering us 99-1 on a daily basis. And so we have the opportunity through our blessings and our material possessions to reach others for the cause of the kingdom. And I pray that we will always keep that as one of the primary things that we try to do here at Shiva. If you have a desire to make a decision for the Lord today, whatever that decision might be, we're going to ask you to stand and sing, recognizing that it's the Lord who can take care of all these things in our lives, straighten us out, and keep us walking on the path that allows us to be as generous and as sharing as possible where we're blessing other people's lives. Let's stand and sing.